Marriage and the demoralization therewith. The modern world is filled with institutions that have been stripped of meaning, sad crepuscular shadows of what we as mankind universally feel was once there, whether consciously or otherwise. In this world, we're left with an unfortunate decision we all must make. Will we choose to assimilate into this world of meaninglessness, or position ourselves against it, often becoming jaded in the process? Not too long ago, I thought about marriage. I admit, well, somewhat embarrassingly, that it came to mind when I was watching an anime called Tonikaku Kawaii, I highly recommend it by the way, in which marriage plays a significant role. This age-old institution has undergone remarkably little change throughout our collective history, though it has certainly manifested itself in various unique forms, whether it is purely monogamous form, as witnessed in most well-developed cultures, albeit with occasional concubinage, or polygamous form as was common in many lesser developed cultures and societies. The reappearance of polygamy in developed societies in the past couple of hundred years is really quite a humorous thing to think about. It's almost as though we've begun reverting to a more primitive society, as though there was suddenly a shortage of men, as there had been numerous times through history. Something relating to marriage, with a bit less precedent, however, is the modern wedding chapel/venue. I must admit that I have a hatred of these buildings that's perhaps a bit unwarranted, though I do still feel that my hatred is, at the very least, somewhat justified. In our current age of meaninglessness, we often try to recover our aforementioned collective past. This has taken form in multiple ways, though I only wish to write about one of these at this moment: marriage in the modern West. My criticism of wedding venues and chapels does not so much apply to the non-Western world. This is because marriage is not universally understood to be either a religious institution or something to which a ritual is attached. For example, within Buddhism, marriage is secular, and if we look to the Japanese tradition, a Shinto wedding ritual does not appear until shortly before the marriage of Emperor Taisho at the turn of last century. As such, it would be rather foolish and ignorantly Eurocentric of me to pretend otherwise. So please bear in mind that this is exclusively a criticism of the scenario here in the West. To get my thoughts across, I will separate the modern methods of marriage into three main types: utilitarian, religious, and aesthetic. Of these, the only ones with much precedent are the utilitarian and religious, with the aesthetic wedding being a rather modern invention, and I would contend that it is a sad one. What I mean by utilitarian marriage or wedding ought to be fairly obvious. It is one in which little care or attention is given to the aesthetics, but which legally legitimizes the marriage. In our current system, in America at least, this takes its most common form in the practice of the courthouse wedding. The religious wedding is likely also fairly self-explanatory, though I may have a somewhat stricter definition than what you would come up with. By my definition, a religious wedding is not simply one that involves a clergyman presiding over it, but rather one that is fundamentally oriented towards religious concerns. These are likely very uncommon outside of Catholic and Orthodox communities, though they are occasionally seen in more traditionally minded Protestant sects. Note that I am not saying that these are religiously oriented in the sense that the participants view it that way, but rather that it is religiously oriented in its form and design. A traditional Catholic or Orthodox wedding is designed in a purely religious form. It isn't designed primarily as a celebration of people, but rather as a binding under God. It wasn't a later addition to a secular event, intended to make it appear as though it were religious. It is intrinsically religious. If I were referring to the intentions of the participants, the number of weddings which could be called religious would likely either be significantly more or less than what I have assumed, though it would also be somewhat foolish to use the intentions of people to judge, considering neither I nor you can read minds. As for the aesthetic wedding, we retain in large part the aesthetic of the religious wedding, though without the meaning. We may even continue to see a clergyman presiding over the ritual, though at the end of the day it is for the most part just a shallow celebration of two people. There is no deeper philosophical or theological meaning behind this wedding, and it simply means to an end wrapped up in a pretty synthetic bow. There's something admirable about the utilitarian marriage. Its honesty about what it is, its lack of pretension, and the fact that it doesn't mimic something more meaningful all make it somewhat appealing despite it not being aesthetically beautiful. The honesty of it all is a different sort of beauty, a less obvious and deeper one. In contrast to the aesthetic marriage, the lack of aesthetic beauty is not so much a thing at which you are disgusted, but rather a breath of fresh air. It is a release from the constant battering of our souls by the unauthentic. The aesthetic wedding, though it has no more meaning than a utilitarian one, pretends that it is something more. It pretends to be a religious marriage. This pseudo-religious quality is not at all confined to marriage, but has permeated America since its founding, and unfortunately very nearly infected the entire world. We Americans have been raised in a nation in which our founding documents express this very same pseudo-religion. I'm certainly not the first to write about the American civic religion, though I think it is most definitely worth mentioning. The mentioning of a vague, generic creator has influenced all of American culture over a very short history, for better or for worse. In a religious marriage, the authenticity of the utilitarian marriage is retained. Added to it, however, is the very same aesthetic beauty that is imitated in the aesthetic wedding. This is the ideal, but sadly, like most things, it is all but vanished from our current paradigm. The utilitarian marriage can be the symbolic representative of the acceptance of our modern society and its meaninglessness. Instead of denying the meaninglessness of modern man like the aesthetic marriage, the utilitarian marriage accepts it and embraces it, almost as if it were true meaning. Marriage may just be a single facet of the problem, but it illustrates well one of the fundamental problems of our society. Well, perhaps not one of the fundamental problems so much as it is one of the most visible consequences of the philosophy which guides most of us. Perhaps I'm just an oddity and nobody else really has the same experience, but when I go outside into the world and look around me, I very often feel little more than disappointment and even disgust. It is a special kind of demoralizing to live within a society in which you are unable to find much that you don't despise. I wish that I could have lived a life in which I found beauty in something other than nature, or at least without having to fly to another continent. The world we've built is ugly, and there's little more I can say about it. It is a mimicry of the past, stripped of all the meaning of the past. In this way, it reflects the people who have created it, who have given it life. All meaning of the past has been taken from us, and as a response, we often attempt to recreate the past, although most of the time these attempts end up being somewhat less than impressive. We as a people are without meaning, without purpose, and without hope.